I'm going to be reading something from 1985 from the Voluntarist newspaper. You may have not heard of this, but it's from issue 17. They had a lot of issues where they talked about so many different subjects that are so powerful for the current day and age. If you care about freedom, you care about humankind, well, they use a very powerful analogy here which might trigger some people, using slavery and comparing it to the government. But if you truly are open-minded, you will think about it for yourself. I'm going to put some questions on the screen for you. I want you to ask yourself these questions in your own head before you watch the video. Then watch the video, and then we'll wrap it up and see what you think. Let's get started. Are you voting for a new slave master? Well, the condition of the slaves relative to their master is more or less the same as that of the subjects to the state. The master, by either directly or indirectly through a foreman exceeding his natural rights, denies his slaves natural rights, just as the state denies the natural rights of its subjects by its very existence. The condition of the slaves is thus a given before the question of voting rights arises. Their condition indicates that they have a ruler regardless of whether or not the slaves can vote. The same is true of the subjects of the state. Suppose then that the slaves are granted a choice of, say, 2 foremen by the master. The slaves may cast ballots to decide which foreman will execute rule over the slaves. The foreman who receives the most votes will be the choice of all the slaves. Presumably, the slaves will each choose what he or she thinks is the lesser of the 2 evils. The situation of the slave thus becomes analogous to that of the subject who has been granted the right to vote for his ruler. Well, in light of this slavery analogy, what is immoral about choosing the lesser of 2 evils if that is the only choice one has under the circumstances? To answer this question, first of all, the choice is one that affects the lives of others beside the chooser. Using the slave analogy, the vote of each slave isn't just a choice of which foreman will rule that slave, but is a choice of who will rule all the slaves. Thus, each slave that votes is acting in the capacity of the master respecting his slaves. To vote for a foreman is to take part in the process of other people's enslavement. It should be clear that by voting, the slave in respect to his peers is going as far beyond his or her natural rights as the master or the foreman does respecting his or her slaves. Moreover, the possibility certainly exists in the slavery analogy that not all the slaves may be in agreement as to which of the 2 foremen is the lesser of the 2 evils. Most importantly, some or all of the slaves may decide that the lesser of the 2 evils is still evil, and on this basis refuse to vote. In either case, the immorality of voting is quite obvious. It is also obvious that assuming one only has the choice of the lesser or greater of the 2 evils in the slavery analogy is begging the question. Under what compulsion are we to make such a choice? Why not pass up both of them? The slaves do not need to choose one or the other of the 2 foremen. By making such a choice, the slaves are merely doing yet another thing that the master wants them to do. Instead of choosing either foreman, one or more of the slaves may choose neither. This third choice, also open to the slaves, is a moral one, for it doesn't affect coercion towards others, unlike voting. Furthermore, the refusal to vote is a first step toward restoring individual sovereignty. If the slave does what the master wants him or her to do, he or she will most assuredly remain a slave. The master, for example, wouldn't give his or her slaves the right to vote if the slaves could thereby become free. By refusing to vote, the slave is not doing what the master wants him or her to do. If most of the slaves refuse to vote, the master would have to choose the foreman for them. However, the master and foreman would then be up against a group that has refused to barter his or her individual sovereignty for the lesser of the 2 evils the master had originally offered, let alone give it up for nothing. And so it would be for the state that failed to get barely any of its subjects to participate in the electoral process. Now, I'm not expecting for the whole world to just stop voting. I don't think that's necessarily the most practical action step to get us out of this mess, although it may help just a little bit to realize that any participation in the government, like Leo Tolstoy said, is effectually immoral, just as we described in this article. And bear in mind, Leo Tolstoy is known as one of the greatest writers of all time. I even did a video about him, and he shares specific strategies of what we can do. And those strategies mainly are about education. Because if you educate enough people, all it takes is one community, one town, or a certain amount of people saying, we're just not going to pay taxes, we're not going to go along with any act that supports the current system that be. The slave can run away from the plantation or defend himself and essentially get away from the plantation. That's what happened in the 1800s. And so that's exactly what can happen with getting away from the government. Most people think it's an impossibility, that you have to do it within the system. But then you're still in the system. The only way to get out of the system is getting out of the system. Grow food forests, be self-reliable, have self-sustainability, have the ability to defend yourself, have the ability to, go about your own business and just leave people alone. I mean, is that a really hard thing to do? Most people do it every day, but when they participate in politics, that's the exception. So it's not really a hard thing to do. It just takes a little bit of courage to take that extra step to say, I'm not going to do all this facade. I'm not going to do all this elusive paperwork. I'm not going to be giving you a portion of my income because it's mine. That's my ownership. And if it's my ownership, then I'm not a slave to say that it's mine. But if you say that it's yours and I have no choice but to go with it because violence will be done upon me, you're taking my property, you're claiming ownership over what I own, you're saying I'm a slave. And that is horrible. Nobody deserves to be a slave. Everybody is free, and they simply need to embrace it. And so I think the time will come, but we have to start by sharing this message with the world, because most people would rather just engage in the two-party election system, three-party election system, in the system either way. Whether they're doing paperwork or not, whether they're voting or not, it's all illusion. The only true path to freedom is voluntarism, just being free, educating others on what freedom actually is, self-ownership. That's it. And then standing on that. Not trying to find a way around it, but standing on it, directly in its face. And if you want to learn a lot more about this and learn those specific action steps, go to theliberator.us. That's theliberator.us. Thank you very much for watching.